Just wait 2 more minutes to start our session. Okay, professor. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your presence in our second public session. A stronger Europe in the world is the subject of this second public session to be held during our Utopia Week. A strong, fair, and open trade agenda is the key to strengthening the EU's role as a global leader while ensuring the highest standards of climate, environmental, and labor protections. European leadership also means working closely with neighboring countries, introducing a comprehensive strategy on Africa, and reaffirming the Europe perspective of the countries of the Western Balkans, with which Utopia is fully aligned. The Commission seeks a coordinated approach to external action that secures a stronger and more united voice for Europe in the world. Professor Nuno Severiano Teixeira is this session's keynote speaker. He is the president of the Portuguese Institute of International Relations, full professor of international relations at Nova University Lisbon, and former vice rector of Nova University between 2013 and 2017. He holds a PhD in History of International Relations by the European University Institute in Florence. He acted as Minister of Defense from 2006 to 2009 and as Minister of Home Affairs from 2000 to 2002. This is today's Utopia Public Contribution for a Better Europe. Please welcome Professor Jean Teixeira.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for your kind words. First of all, let me thank you for having me today. It's my great pleasure to be here today in this Utopia Week at the Nova University of Lisbon. And I was asked by our rector to say something about a stronger Europe. As you well know, perhaps better than me, there are different ways of speaking about stronger Europe in economic terms, in social, political, diplomatic, cultural, and so on. But as we are in a period of war in Europe, the war, unfortunately, came to Europe again, I would like to share with you some remarks about a stronger Europe in terms of security and defense. And in the context of the war in Ukraine, which are the main impacts that the war have in our collective security in Europe. Well, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is having surprising consequences. For me, at least, surprising consequences. Because first, is strengthening the transatlantic link between Europe and the United States. And second, is completely renewing the European security order. Let me just say 2 or 3 remarks about each one of these topics. First, the transatlantic bond. At the beginning of the invasion in Ukraine, Putin's strategic goal, in addition to Ukraine, of course, was first to divide the West, to separate Europe from the United States. Second, divide and weaken the European Union. And third, and mainly, I think, to move away NATO from the Russian border. Well, 1 year and after, almost, it just got the opposite. I mean, what he achieved is precisely the contrary of its initial strategic goals. The West, so far, remained united. Europe and the United States are coordinating their strategic responses to Russia. Second, with the invasion of Ukraine, NATO, to some extent, gained a new meaning, political and strategic meaning, because to some extent, NATO gained again the new old traditional threat. So historically, the Soviet Union, and now Russia. And this had political and military consequences for NATO. Politically, because the process of enlargement of NATO is ongoing. So Finland is already the neutral countries, traditional neutral countries. Finland has already joined, and Sweden will join, I think, soon. But secondly, at the military level, after a certain crisis of identity during the post-Cold War, where NATO has, to some extent, to invent a new product, strategic product, which was security providing in international terms, the traditional threat brought back the traditional mission, military mission of NATO. I mean, collective security. And finally, and this is what is more surprising for me, is the case of the European Union. Because the European Union, despite all differences, all cleavages, all divisions among its member states, remained united. At the economic level, the European Union is at its, I think, 11th package of sanctions, economic sanctions. Politically, which is also new, opened the door to Ukraine to join the European Union. Very, very fast in comparison with other cases. And finally, the so-called civil power, normative power, as European Union used to call herself, is providing military aid to Ukraine. And more than this, is increasing defense budgets since a long time. Second, the European Security Order is changing also radically the European Security Order. All the principles, political principles, and all the diplomatic instruments that founded the European Security Order after the Cold War, in the post-Cold War, are to some extent now expired. Why? Because look at, for instance, Helsinki Final Act and the idea of the inviolability of the borders established after the Second World War. Think about the European Security Charter and the idea of the indivisibility of the security in Europe. Look at the Founding Act and the relationship, the political relationship between NATO and Russia in the framework of the NATO-Russia Council. Many times during the period that I had political responsibilities, I had the opportunity to sit in this Russia-NATO Council, and it was a forum of confidence-building measures. I mean, well, took place in the same room and the Atlantic Council, and at the end of the agenda, Mr. Lavrov entered, and in a very informal way, there was a discussion about common interests between Russia and NATO countries. But it was mainly the most important was the confidence building measures. There was a place where we can speak to each other. Well, all of this now is dead. All of this is dead. And in my view, is dead after the invasion of Ukraine. And in my view, this situation has, for our European security, two very important political consequences. The first one is the end of the idea of the indivisibility of the European security. if you think, since the 60s, 70s of the last century, since the Ostpolitik of the Willy Brandt Chancellor, until Angela Merkel, and the energetic relation between Germany and Russia, the idea was always that Russia had to be inside of the European security order. Russia should be in. Well, what we see now is that from that moment on, the idea is that Russia should be out of the European security order. And this is the first consequences for the architecture of our European security. The second consequence, in my view, is the fact that Ukraine is no longer a buffer state. During a long period, during the period of the post-Cold War, Ukraine worked as a buffer state between Russia and the Western world, and Europe. Well, after the invasion, this international functionality of a buffer state ended completely. Today, Ukraine is the border, not the buffer, but the border between Russia and Europe. And we do not know yet, but if some of the trends that we are witnessing in the international scene are consolidated, it will be not only the border between Russia and Europe, it will be the border between the Euro-Atlantic community, Europe and the United States on the one hand, and the Eurasian community on the other, I mean Russia and China. This has obviously a political translation, which is democracy on one hand and autocracy on the other. But it's another topic, not to discuss today. Well, so there are today for us in Europe other challenges and other threats than Russia. Of course, the challenge of China, but it's a challenge of a completely different nature. We have the persistence of the traditional transnational non-military threats, mainly in the southern flank of Europe. But of course, for the time being, the main territorial, direct, immediate threat is Russia. Well, if you think about these geopolitical transformations, the question that we can raise when thinking about a stronger Europe in terms of security and defense is which are the impacts of this geopolitical transformation over the European security, and in particular over the two political and military instruments that we have, the European Union on one hand and NATO on the other. Let me just briefly give you some remarks about this. When we think about the Russian threat, the priority for the European security is defense, collective defense. And in this context, when we talk about collective defense, the right instrument to provide collective defense is NATO. No doubt about that. And why? Because NATO is the only political and military instrument with the capabilities that we need to provide collective defense. I mean, military means command and control structure and the culture of deterrence. So, but there is another reason. More than this, it's the only military instrument with capabilities to do the job. But there is another reason. After Brexit, NATO is the only institutional platform where we can associate the UK to the European defense and security. So the priority for Europe in terms of security and defense is NATO. And of course, it's related, closely related with the relationship with the United States. But there is always a but. We are aware, we Europeans, we are aware that the strategic priority for the United States is not the Atlantic, and it's not Europe. Today, the strategic priority for the United States is China and Indo-Pacific. And we have to be aware of this. And there's another reason. And the other reason is the fact that we have in our memory the Trump administration years and the possibility of a new Trump administration or something like that. That means that the Europeans, of course, have to guarantee some strategic autonomy for defense and security in Europe. Not to compete with the United States, but to act, to have the means to act when the United States are not interested to act. So this is the point that I would like to stress. And in this framework, in this context, which is the place, which is the role of European Union in terms of security and defense. In other words, which is the role of the European security and defense policy in the framework of the European Union. If we look at the typology of the different military missions, from the top, collective security, then security providing, and finally crisis management, so soft to the hard security. European Union as a civil power or a normative power, as usually the identity of the European Union used to think itself, always in terms of European security and defense policy focused on the lower level of the military missions. I mean, the most soft power, crisis management, and not more than crisis management, and has no other means to play other military role. And probably the European Union must continue to do so. Why? Because, of course, defense collective, the collective defense on the eastern flank before the Russian threat will be a task for NATO, and the European Union, of course, has to concentrate on the southern flank and perhaps in non-military threats. But the European Union can and must develop some capabilities, some instruments to be able to perform the other military tasks. It will not be fast, it will not be easy, but anyway, it's possible. What am I talking about? I'm talking about some instruments that the European Union already has. European Peace Facility. European Peace Facility is the instrument that the European Union is using to fund the military aid to Ukraine. Second, the European Union launched in that proposal the idea of a joint procurement for military means. So this is the good way. But I think that the European Union can go further in this area. For instance, permanent structure cooperations, which is an instrument for the European defense. It has been used only on crisis management. Should be extended, can be extended to other roles of the European Union. Or the European Defence Fund for technological innovation. Only it's concentrated on crisis management. It could be extended to other tasks. So this movement could be make Europe stronger in terms of security and defense. You can ask, well, is this easy? No, it's not easy. To some extent, it is difficult. But it's a way possible. It would require a stronger and permanent institutional cooperation between NATO and EU, between the military planning of NATO and this kind of programs like the European Defence Fund or the permanent structural cooperations in the framework of the EU. But it will be possible, in my view. It would be a long way, but it would be the way that make possible two things at the same time. First, Europe to be a credible ally with the United States in the framework of NATO. The burden sharing is always something asked by the United States. It could provide a more equal burden sharing. But at the same time, Europe could have some strategic autonomy to act when the United States do not want to act. And, well, you can say, well, you are dreaming. Yes, to some extent I'm dreaming. But this dream is possible. It can be possible. And if we do this in Europe, we could at the same time to reinforce, to strengthen the transatlantic link and gain some strategic autonomy for Europe. How? Usually traditionally in Europe, when we think about the strategic autonomy for Europe, we are thinking a defense system outside of NATO and to compete with NATO. This would be another way. This would be a strong European defense, but developed inside NATO and with NATO. And this could eventually make Europe stronger and at the same time make the transatlantic link stronger. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay. We will now open the session to some questions from the audience. Sorry, the mics, just for my colleagues that are helping out with the mics. Any question in the room? Sorry, it's here. Oh, they have mics up there, so they will come down. Can you please bring the mic here? Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Rita Falcão from Nova. Thank you for your presentation. I know this is a topic that leaves people a little bit uncomfortable, but I would like to ask you, what happened with COVID, with the pandemic, universities, research institutions aligned very easily with the outside society, outside academia, to develop joint solutions for dealing with the pandemic. I'm also thinking that United States is a single country, China is a single country, Russia is a single country, Turkey, single country. Europe, it's not. And the topic of the war, of defense, it's not as there is not a single opinion as it is so obvious in the pandemic, because we needed to react very fast. So my question is, in this context, are the universities, research institutions in some way anticipating their role if there is the conflict escalates to some level? Is this being different states in Europe, is this it's going to be a problem in your view? And I don't know if the question was clear, but what will be the role of the universities? Will be able to align? Are we aligned with the European Commission as a whole? Things like this. Thank you.
Okay. For me, in my view, the role of the universities is crucial in the future in every area of the knowledge. I mean, you mentioned two situations: the war, the current war, and a pandemic. That means that today we have a concept of security is larger than the military security. On the side of war, today you have the military threat, traditional military threat. When you think about pandemic, it's a question of security, nothing to do with the military questions. But it's something that affects the security of the population as the war affects the security of the population. So the first thing that we have to think about is the large concept of security. And in that framework, knowledge is fundamental. Medicine, genetics, vaccines, and so on, in what regards pandemics, or, as we are unfortunately seeing in the war, the most developed technology at the use of the war, missiles and so on and so on. So in every component of this, this concept, we have knowledge. And the knowledge is a production of the universities and the research centers. For me, the question is, which is the relationship between the research, the centers, where the knowledge is product, and the centers of the decision centers. This is one of the questions that some countries have solved this problem, the relationship between knowledge and decision, quite well. Others, no. And I think this relationship must be strengthened, must be developed, and the universities, of course, play a role important in this framework.
Uh, Okay.
Hello, my name is Luís Carneiro from Nova. My question is simple or not. How strong can Europe become as an ally of NATO before it upsets the other parts of NATO?
Well, what I was trying to say is that we can develop a European capability to cooperate inside NATO. Because even if the countries are the same or almost the same, the relationship between the European countries and NATO is an individual relationship. I mean, Portugal, member of NATO, Spain, member of NATO, UK, member of NATO, France, member of NATO. But there is no relation between EU and NATO. So, in my view, there are people who do not think as I do. But anyway, in my view, the European countries would be stronger if they act collectively as European Union. For two reasons, my view. First is because we could invest the same and have much more outcome. Because if you invest diversely, divided by 27 countries is one thing. If you are investing on one thing, optimizing the resources, you would get much more outcome. So this is the first reason. The second one is politically, and is the relationship inside the organization, the NATO organization. If you have one country on one hand, very, very powerful, and 27 divided by them, it's one thing. If you have United States on one hand and Europe on the other, you have a much more balanced relationship. Of course, the difficulty will be to coordinate inside the European Union. And that's why I was saying that it's a difficult and a long way. But in my view, it's the correct way.
Where is the other question? Because I could not see.
Yes.
It's not because we're the hosts that we have the monopoly on the question. So.
I wanted to ask a question regarding getting closer to the United States, and it is that if a continent like Europe gets closer to the United States, shouldn't we worry about the fact that this single country has a bigger population and a bigger influence in a lot of aspects than Europe does? Also, given into account that Europe is not, as you said, a single country with diverging interests, and the part that concerns me the most is the fact that currently populism and ultranationalism is rising in the US and Europe. Shouldn't we worry about getting closer to all of this? Thanks.
Shouldn't worry, I didn't understand.
About getting closer to all this, if I understood well.
Yes.
To internationalism, to the
To United
internationalism
States
threat of the United
and these ideas. Oh yeah, I didn't say my name, by the way. Paul, Pompeu Fabra, University, Barcelona.
Can you please repeat the last part
Slowly.
of the question?
Please.
Shouldn't we worry then about getting closer to the United States,
okay.
given the political implications and also military ones?
Okay. It's not a question of to be closer. No? We are allies in the framework of NATO, and if that's what I was telling to the previous question. If you act collectively, you have a much more balanced relation of power. If you have someone very powerful on one hand and 27 divided by them, some of them little or medium countries, they have no capacity of counterbalance. If you act collectively, you have a much more balanced power. So the question is not to be closer, the question is to be a credible ally, to act jointly when it is needed, or to act separately when the interests are different from Europe and the United States. That's it.
Yes? Here, in the middle?
Yes,
There are two hands raised. So
a good question. Carmen Perez, again, also from Pompeu Fabra University. My question is rather an issue or diplomacy. What happened before the invasion? Could we say diplomacy failed? What can diplomacy achieve in a situation such as the previous days or months before conflict, a war conflict? Could they have done it better and stop the
I
war?
don't know. I have some. It's a good question. It's a good question. Why diplomacy failed? I am not sure if diplomacy has been tried. We have two explanations for that regarding the origins of the war. And I think these two explanations are based in different conceptions of the way to think international relations. On one hand, we have the idea of the imperial principle. I mean, the idea that the great powers have the right to organize what they call the area of interest, and in that area, all the other countries have no more than a limited sovereignty. So this is the imperial principle. You know, in the history, Napoleon, Hitler, and so on and so on. So they think that they have the right to impose to the neighbors in the area, the geographic area. They think that this is it is the security area for them to impose their will. And I think this is the principle according which Putin acted. He wanted to reorganize the post-Soviet area, and he thinks that Ukraine is part of this reordering of the post-Soviet area. On the other, we have the democratic principle that people have right to dispose of themselves, according with the Charter of the United Nations. Each nation has the right to decide about their future. And it was the principle according which Ukraine acted. Well, they say, well, we have the right to choose democracy and to choose Europe. And Putin said, well, we have the right to impose you autocracy and the ex-Soviet, the Russian area. And these two principles are in confrontation. And before the invasion, there was the argument of both parts according with this principle, but with no, at least visible will to negotiate, to work diplomacy, you know. And that's why, so if we put it in concrete terms, Putin said, well, the expansion of NATO to get closer to the Russian borders is a threat, and I have the right to move them away. And Ukraine say, well, but we are a democratic nation, we voted, we want to be European and democratic. So it was very, very difficult, the negotiation before. And it's very, very difficult negotiation today, still today. I am a little bit concerned about the future.
can we have one or
yeah,
two more?
yes,
Because
of course,
these are
of
the
course.
last questions, the two questions in the center of the...
Thank you very much. Sorry for the others that have questions and can't ask. Many thanks for your food for thought and your approach to strengthen both NATO and European strategic autonomy. Regarding European strategic autonomy, it's linked, from my point of view, to the industrial autonomy, strategic autonomy. And if we go further, to the development of sensibility, or how can I say, defense and security culture within university research approach.
Yes.
How this question is approaches at European level. We have for sure many documents regarding interferences, but it's not only dealing with foreign interferences, but really a European civil security and defense approach. How would you manage or propose or imagine this future? Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. It's a tough question. When we think about our security in Europe, of course we have to think not only in military terms, like we are today in this situation, but in a much more larger terms. Because security and autonomy, strategic autonomy, as usually we used to say, is much more than military autonomy. So as you mentioned, industry, energy, economy, all of these areas, European Union needs to have some capabilities in terms of, and I think this consciousness began not in the current war, but during the pandemics. When we in Europe discovered that we have no masks, and our masks must come from China, or ventilators, or very simple things, then we discovered that we have to re-industrialize Europe. So to diminish the chains of value that globalization made, and we are completely dependent. The same in energetic terms. As in Portugal, we are a little bit less dependent on less dependent than energy in Russia, but in Central and Eastern Europe, as you know better than me, this is a problem, and this change has costs. So, because we receive our gas from North Africa, Algeria. Yes, autonomy, we have to think autonomy in a broader term regarding economy, energy, technology, digitalization, and not only in military terms, if I understood your question.
It's working.
Okay. Alberto from Siwa University. I totally agree with you on the fact that Europe needs more cooperation to counterbalance US. But one, will the US accept that, or they will prefer to keep the kingmaker role? And second, there are countries bound by treaties of neutrality inside the European Union. I'm thinking about Austria now, also because Sweden and Finland decided to live this stance of neutrality. How is it possible for European Union to join an alliance that will make them not neutral anymore?
Thank you. Every crisis has an opportunity. And I think this crisis gives us Europeans an opportunity in that terms. First, will the Americans be available for this? I think yes. Why? First, because of burden sharing. They want Europeans spend more in their defense and not to pay the European defense? So this is the first question, and this is important for the Americans. And this was not only the Trump administration. I heard President Obama in the room saying, well, you have to spend more. You are a developed area of the world, and you must pay your defense. Obama, not Trump. So the first reason why I think it's the right time is burden sharing. But there's another one, perhaps much more important for us, which is the international situation. As we know, priority for the United States is China and Pacific. So they would like not to divide resources between Pacific and the Atlantic, between China and Russia. And they will be interested in to be concentrated on the Pacific and on China and spend less in Europe and in the Atlantic. And that situation could be a good opportunity for Europeans to go further in the European defense. In my view, the problem is not on the side of the Americans, but in our side. If we are able to find a consensus to profit this opportunity that we have today.
Thank you. Okay, so I think this is it. Thank you very much, Professor Severiano Teixeira, for
My pleasure.
your participation in Utopia. And we are expecting to have more of your participation in Utopia too from now on. This was, I guess, a success, at least a record on
Wish you an excellent week,
Yes.
Utopia week.
So
Thank you.
keep up. I wish you a continuation of your good work here. If you have any questions, let us know. Our next keynote session will be tomorrow at the same time under the theme An Economy That Works for People with Pedro Brinca from Nova School of Business and Economics. Thank you very much and enjoy your afternoon.